The red altar smelled of crushed pine and impending humiliation. Chapter 1. Odelia stood dead center in the ancient ceremonial ring. The cold, jagged stone bit through the thin soles of her shoes. The winter wind howled down from the Black Vein Mountains, whipping her dark hair across her pale face. She kept her chin lifted. A silver mating bracelet clattered against the blood-red rock. It rolled twice. It stopped dead at the tip of her boot. "I reject you." Cormac's voice echoed through the silent amphitheater, amplified by the curved stone walls. He didn't even bother to look her in the eye. He stared just above her head, his lip curled in absolute disgust. The words struck Odelia like physical blows. A low collective gasp rippled through the gathered pack members. Hundreds of wolves sat in the tiered seating, their eyes burning with morbid curiosity. "You are wolfless," Cormac sneered. He wrapped a thick, muscular arm around the waist of a curvy blonde female beside him. A defective burden. The borderlands require a Luna with claws and strength. Not a fragile human playing dress-up in a wolf's world, the blonde female laughed. The sound was sharp and grating, echoing over the altar. The scent of cheap jasmine perfume rolled off the new female, completely masking Cormac's familiar cedar musk. It made Odelia's stomach turn. She kept her spine perfectly straight. She locked her trembling knees. "Look at her," a harsh voice whispered from the front row. Not even a whimper. "Broken thing," another added, the scent of their amusement thick in the air. "Can't even produce a shift spark. Good riddance." The mockery grew louder. Cruel laughter erupted from the borderland elites, bouncing off the ancient pillars. Odelia closed her eyes. She inhaled the sharp scent of the approaching winter storm. She refused to let them see her break. She just needed to turn around. She just needed to walk down the stone steps and leave this miserable pack behind forever. She shifted her weight to step back. The air pressure vanished. A suffocating primal aura slammed into the red altar. It was heavy, dark, and tasted intensely of ozone and fresh blood. It felt like the sky itself was crashing down upon them. The laughter died instantly. Throats clicked shut. Whimpers of pure, instinctual terror broke out across the amphitheater. Odelia gasped for breath. Her lungs burned against the sudden, crushing weight in the atmosphere. From the highest obsidian throne in the royal box, a figure rose. King Alpha Thane. He wore no crown, only a tailored black suit that strained against massive predator-honed muscles. He descended the stone steps, slowly, deliberately. Every heavy footfall echoed like a war drum. Wolves in the crowd dropped to their knees immediately, their necks bared instinctively in absolute submission. The scent of their fear clouded the altar. Cormac took a hurried step back. The arrogant smugness drained completely from his face. It was replaced by sheer wide-eyed terror. He shoved the blonde female behind him. Thane did not look at his brother. His eyes, burning like molten gold in the fading daylight, remained fixed entirely on Odelia. The intensity of his stare paralyzed her. He stepped into the center of the red altar. The temperature plummeted to freezing. The loud crunch of metal shattered the dead silence. Odelia looked down. Thane's heavy combat boot rested exactly where the silver bracelet had been. He ground the intricate metal into worthless dust against the stone. "Brother," Cormac stammered, dropping to one knee. "My king. I only meant to silence." The single word radiated pure, unfiltered dominance. It rattled Odelia's teeth in her skull. Her survival instinct screamed at her to run. Her legs refused to obey the command. Thane stepped directly into her personal space. He was a towering wall of blistering heat and dark intent. The scent of ancient woods, crushed ice, and dangerous power enveloped her completely. It drowned out everything else in the world. A large, heavily scarred hand shot out, his long, rough fingers wrapped securely around the fragile nape of her neck. The grip was shockingly possessive, utterly unyielding. Odelia gasped aloud. Her hands flew up automatically, pressing flat against his solid, unmoving chest. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped, panicked bird. "You discard what belongs to the crown," Thane's voice rumbled. It was deep, lethal, and echoed with the growl of his inner beast. A grave mistake, Cormac. He didn't wait for his brother's trembling response. Thane yanked Odelia flush against his hard body. "She is no borderland reject," the king roared to the terrified masses, his voice shaking the remaining dust from the pillars. "She is Odelia, and she is my Luna." Before Odelia could even process the impossible, terrifying words, his mouth crashed down on hers. It was not a kiss of romance. It was a violent brand of absolute ownership. His lips were demanding and bruising, tasting of wild magic and raw, undisputed power. Panic exploded inside Odelia's chest. The alpha pressure radiating from him was crushing her to dust. She shoved frantically against his broad shoulders. It was like pushing against a solid mountain of granite. This wasn't salvation. This was a different, far more terrifying cage. Thane broke the brutal kiss. His breathing was ragged, his massive chest heaving against her small frame. His golden eyes flared with unnatural, blinding brightness. The beast inside him was fully awake, practically clawing at the surface of his skin. "Mine," he growled, a vibration that rattled her bones. He forcibly tilted her head to the side, exposing the fragile, pale line of her neck to the freezing air. Odelia's breath hitched violently. She felt the sharp, terrifying scrape of his elongated fangs graze her pulsing collarbone. He was going to mark her, right here, in front of the entire terrified kingdom. "No," she choked out, her voice cracking with pure fear. His fangs pierced her tender flesh. A single hot drop of blood welled to the surface. Then the world shattered. A blinding shock wave of pure obsidian black light erupted from the very core of Odelia's chest. It screamed through the freezing air like a dying star. The scent of ozone instantly turned to the smell of burning ash and ancient decay. The dark blast hit the Alpha King at point-blank range. Thane was violently ripped away from her body. The sheer impossible force of the black energy hurled the most powerful wolf in the Empire backward through the air. He flew 10 meters and slammed brutally into the thick stone amphitheater wall. The solid rock cracked, splintered, and crumbled inward under the massive impact. Dust and debris billowed out into the freezing air, choking the altar. Odelia dropped hard to her knees, gasping for oxygen. Her pale skin smoked with dark, lingering energy that she didn't recognize. Her veins felt like they were filled with liquid shadow. The red altar was dead silent. Chapter 2. The dust settled in a choking gray cloud. Odelia stayed on the cold stone floor, her hands shaking violently against her thighs. The metallic scent of blood and pulverized rock filled her nose, overpowering the winter chill. She stared blankly at the caved-in amphitheater wall. A deep, rumbling chuckle echoed from the dark debris. Thane stepped out of the ruined stone. His tailored black suit jacket was torn, gray dust clinging to his massive shoulders. He didn't look angry, nor did he look injured. He looked entirely, terrifyingly thrilled. He wiped a streak of blood from the corner of his mouth with a calloused thumb. "Fascinating," he murmured into the silence. The single, low word carried effortlessly across the dead silent arena. Cormac remained frozen on his knees, his jaw hanging open in pure shock. The blonde female beside him was trembling so hard her teeth clicked together. The rest of the pack didn't dare breathe, their heads bowed low in absolute terror. Thane didn't spare his brother a single glance, his glowing golden eyes locked onto Odelia. The predator inside him was practically purring, the heavy sound vibrating in the cold air. "Bring the carriage around," Thane commanded, never breaking eye contact with her. "We are returning to the Black Vein Mountains, now." Two massive royal guards immediately stepped forward from the shadows. They moved with terrifying, unnatural speed. Before Odelia could scramble backward, rough-gloved hands grabbed her upper arms. "Wait!" she gasped, kicking out instinctively. "Let me go!" Her struggles were utterly useless against the trained warriors. They hauled her up like a fragile rag doll, ignoring her frantic kicks. Thane watched her fight with cold, calculating amusement. He turned his broad back on the red altar and walked toward the exit archway. He didn't say goodbye to his pack. He just claimed his prize and walked away. The royal carriage was a rolling fortress of black iron and dark velvet. Odelia was shoved roughly through the heavy side door. She stumbled, landing hard on the plush, midnight blue cushions inside. The heavy iron door slammed shut behind her, the lock engaging with a heavy, final metallic clunk. The air inside the cabin was suffocatingly thick. It smelled intensely of old leather, crushed bergamot, and the terrifying, lingering ozone of the Alpha King. "Mind the tea, little bird." Odelia flinched backward. She snapped her head up, her eyes wide. A man sat casually in the opposite corner of the spacious cabin. He had messy silver hair, sharp features, and a sly, fox-like grin. He comfortably crossed one long leg over the other. A delicate porcelain teacup rested delicately in his gloved hands. This was Bram. He was the king's lead enforcer, his master of dark arts, and a lethal weapon in his own right. "You pack quite a punch," Bram noted, taking a slow, obnoxiously loud sip of his tea. "I've served his terrifying majesty for a very long time. I have never seen anyone throw him 10 meters through solid rock." He chuckled, the sound bright and entirely out of place in the tense gloom of the carriage. "I might just frame that memory. I will put it right above the fireplace in the great hall." Odelia backed entirely into the farthest corner of the seat. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped animal. She pressed her hands flat against the freezing cold glass of the window. The carriage jolted forward suddenly, the massive iron wheels grinding heavily against the dirt road. She frantically searched for a door handle. There was nothing but smooth wood on the inside. "Don't bother," Bram said, setting his teacup down on a small built-in table. "It's locked from the outside, warded with blood magic, too. Though considering that little light show you just pulled off back there, maybe wards mean absolutely nothing to you." Odelia didn't answer him. Her breathing remained fast, shallow, and laced with pure panic. She curled her knees up to her chest, her survival instinct screaming at her to find a sharp weapon. The heavy carriage lurched to a sudden violent halt. The iron door swung open, letting in a brutal blast of freezing mountain wind. The air pressure in the cabin instantly doubled, making Odelia's ears pop. Thane climbed inside. He filled the small space entirely. His broad, heavily muscled shoulders brushed the velvet ceiling. The sheer, overwhelming heat radiating from his massive body chased away the winter chill in mere seconds. Bram immediately stopped smiling. He picked up his teacup and stared intensely out the opposite window, feigning complete ignorance. Thane ignored his enforcer entirely. He sat down heavily on the bench directly across from Odelia. The carriage lurched forward again, picking up a dangerous rocking speed. The king leaned forward slowly. He braced his thick forearms on his knees. His golden predatory eyes locked directly onto her pale, terrified face. He didn't say a single word. He just sat there and stared at her. The silence dragged out, heavy, dark, and suffocating. Odelia pressed herself harder into the velvet cushions, desperately wishing she could melt right through the iron wall behind her. "Look at me." His voice was a low, vibrating command that shook the floorboards. Odelia kept her eyes glued firmly to his scuffed, dust-covered combat boots. If she looked at him, her body would naturally submit. The border pack had always beaten submission into her bones. A low, vibrating growl rumbled in the tight space. Thane moved with blinding, impossible speed. He crossed the small distance between them in a single heartbeat. He dropped onto the cushion right beside her, his heavy thigh pressing solidly against hers. Odelia gasped loudly, her head snapping up in pure shock. His angular face was mere inches from hers. The heavy scent of dark woods, old magic, and raw, undeniable power flooded her senses completely. It was dizzying. It was entirely intoxicating. "I said, look at me," Thane whispered, his golden eyes blazing with untamed fire. He didn't grab her throat. He didn't force her head up with physical violence. He simply let his overwhelming, pure alpha aura wash completely over her. But it wasn't the crushing, degrading pressure Cormac had always used. It was a direct challenge. It poked aggressively at the dark, wild energy lying completely dormant in her chest. It dared her to fight back against him. It demanded she rise to his level and stand her ground. Odelia's breath hitched painfully in her throat. She stared deep into the molten gold of his irises. A strange, unfamiliar heat bloomed heavily in her stomach, completely overriding her icy fear. Her fingernails dug sharply into the velvet seat. The massive carriage violently exploded off the ground. A deafening, concussive blast shattered the quiet journey. The heavy iron vehicle tipped dangerously onto two wheels. Odelia screamed aloud as gravity vanished completely beneath her. She flew forward uncontrollably. Thane caught her instantly out of the air, his massive arms wrapped tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his rock-solid chest as the carriage crashed hard back onto the dirt road. Wood splintered loudly. Horses shrieked in pure panicked terror outside. "Ambush!" Bram yelled over the horrific noise. His teacup shattered against the far wall. The silver-haired enforcer's hands instantly ignited with crackling, lethal blue energy. The reinforced glass window right next to Odelia shattered inward with a deafening crash. A dozen black-clad figures swarmed the snowy road outside. The horrific scent of rotting magic, foul blood, and decaying sulfur filled the cold air. Assassins. They carried long, jagged weapons glowing with sickening, sickly green runes. Forbidden death curses. "Stay down," Thane roared over the absolute chaos. He shoved Odelia roughly behind his broad back, shielding her completely with his massive body. He kicked the heavy carriage door right off its thick iron hinges. It flew outward into the snow, smashing brutally into two approaching attackers. Bram leaped gracefully through the broken opening, dark blue magic exploding violently from his open palms. Thane moved to follow his enforcer into the slaughter. His long black claws were fully extended. His sharp fangs were bared in a lethal snarl. The dark beast inside him was entirely loose. A high-pitched, terrifying whistling sound cut sharply through the screaming wind. Time seemed to slow down entirely. Odelia saw it perfectly through the broken window frame. A single jagged black arrow streaked silently through the freezing air. It was dripping heavily with glowing, highly concentrated green venom. It wasn't aimed at the Alpha King. It was aimed directly at her chest. Odelia froze completely. She couldn't draw breath. Her muscles refused to move out of the deadly path. Thane roared with pure, desperate fury. He threw his massive body backward with impossible speed. He reached out with a bare, unprotected hand, intercepting the deadly projectile mere inches from Odelia's racing heart. His massive fist closed firmly around the jagged metal shaft. The sickly green venom hissed aggressively as it touched his bare skin. It burned straight through his tough flesh instantly, turning his dark veins a violent, pulsing necrotic black. Thane didn't make a single sound of pain. His golden eyes rolled completely back in his head. The most powerful, terrifying alpha in the entire empire collapsed heavily onto the wooden carriage floor, landing face down in a rapidly expanding pool of his own poisoned blood. Chapter 3. The hidden cavern smelled of damp earth and rotting magic. Bram dragged the Alpha King's massive body across the jagged rock floor. The Enforcer's silver hair was plastered to his pale forehead with sweat. Crackling blue energy faded from his hands, leaving the dark space illuminated only by a single, shivering lantern he had conjured upon entry. Odelia huddled entirely against the freezing stone wall. Her pale hands were completely stained with the king's dark, thick blood. The sickly green venom was spreading rapidly up Thane's muscular neck, branching out like dark, necrotic spiderwebs beneath his skin. His breathing was a wet, terrifying rattle. Bram dropped heavily to his knees in the dirt. He didn't bother making his usual sarcastic remarks or brewing his calming tea. His sharp, fox-like face was tight with absolute panic as he hovered his glowing palms directly over Thane's ruined, bleeding chest. The blue magic hissed violently against the poisoned wound. "It is a shadow curse," Bram muttered rapidly. His voice shook with a barely contained terror that made Odelia's stomach drop. It was forged in the dark lands specifically to slaughter pureblood alphas and eat their inner wolf completely from the inside out. Odelia stared at the dying king in front of her. He had taken that lethal arrow entirely to protect her from the ambush. He was a terrifying tyrant who had forcefully dragged her from the red altar against her will. Yet he had thrown his own indestructible body in front of certain death, just to shield a wolfless, unwanted reject. The border pack had never once protected her. A strange, magnetic pull tugged sharply at the center of her chest. It was the exact same dark, wild energy that had violently blasted the king across the stone amphitheater. It was no longer lying dormant and quiet inside her fragile ribs. It was awake, and it was screaming at her to move closer to him. Odelia crawled desperately across the cold cave floor. The rough stone tore mercilessly at her bare knees, but she didn't feel the sharp pain at all. She was entirely focused on the massive, bleeding beast lying helpless in the shadows. "Don't touch him," Bram warned sharply. The Enforcer shifted his glowing hands defensively to block her path. His blue eyes flashed with a dangerous, lethal warning in the dim, flickering lantern light. "The venom is highly contagious, and it will kill a fragile human instantly upon the slightest physical contact." Odelia didn't listen to his warning at all. She couldn't stop the violent forward momentum of her own body. Her basic survival instincts were entirely overridden by a primal, overwhelming need to heal the broken Alpha King. She reached out with violently trembling, blood-stained fingers. She pressed her palms flat against his burning chest. The world instantly turned a blinding, terrifying shade of dark black. A massive surge of pure, obsidian energy erupted directly from the center of her chest. It did not blast him away like it had at the mating ceremony. It sank deep into his infected, blackening veins. The sickly green venom hissed aggressively inside the king's body. It fought back against the invading dark magic, like a trapped, cornered animal, fighting for its life. But the ancient power waking up inside Odelia was absolute, unyielding, and terrifyingly hungry for the poison. It wrapped around the lethal curse instantly. Odelia gasped aloud as the toxic magic rushed violently up her own arms. It burned exactly like liquid fire sliding rapidly through her fragile human veins. She didn't scream, and she refused to pull her hands away from his chest. She absorbed every single drop of the lethal shadow curse into her own beating heart. The dark necrotic spiderwebs faded completely from Thane's thick neck. The bleeding, ruined flesh on his shoulder stitched itself closed, leaving behind smooth, completely unblemished skin. Bram gasped loudly, falling entirely backward onto the rough cave floor. He stared at her with wide, terrified eyes. "By the moon," the enforcer whispered into the absolute silence. His voice was completely devoid of its usual arrogant, biting mockery. "You just consumed a lethal shadow curse without burning into a pile of worthless, smoking ash." Odelia collapsed heavily forward against the king's solid chest. She felt completely out of breath and incredibly dizzy, yet she felt strangely energized, the dark magic settling comfortably into the deep marrow of her bones. The heavy, rhythmic beating of Thane's heart grew steadily stronger beneath her pale cheek. A large, incredibly warm hand slowly touched her messy hair. Odelia flinched backward and snapped her head up. Thane's glowing, molten gold eyes were wide open in the dark cavern. The violent, feral beast was completely gone from his predatory gaze. He looked at her with pure, absolute, unquestionable worship. He didn't speak a single word to break the tension. He reached up slowly, his massive bicep flexing with raw power as he moved his heavy arm. His rough thumb gently traced an old, faded scar on her forearm, completely ignoring the lingering black magic smoking from her pale skin. His touch was incredibly, impossibly tender. A violent shiver ran straight down her spine. The heavy scent of ancient woods, crushed ice, and raw power flooded her senses once again. The terrifying Alpha King was looking at her like she was the only precious, sacred thing left in the entire world. The ground suddenly shook violently beneath them. A loud, booming horn shattered the fragile, quiet silence of the hidden cavern. The heavy scent of wet fur, iron armor, and burning pine torches flooded the dark cave entrance. It choked the clean mountain air completely. Bram swore viciously and scrambled to his feet. Cormac, the silver-haired enforcer, snarled, his fangs extending past his lips. He drew a long, curved silver blade from the inside of his heavy winter coat. He brought the entire border army to hunt us down, and we are completely surrounded on all sides. Odelia felt her heated blood turn instantly to ice. Outside the cave, Cormac's arrogant voice echoed loudly. It bounced off the snow-covered trees, artificially amplified by his weak, desperate attempt at an alpha command. "Come out, brother," he shouted, his tone dripping with fake, sickening sorrow. "The witch has poisoned your mind with her dark magic." The terrifying sound of hundreds of wolves growling vibrated heavily through the stone walls. "Hand her over to be cleansed by the pack," Cormac demanded loudly to the mountain, "or we will burn this entire cavern to the ground with you trapped inside it." Thane slowly sat up from the dirt floor. His golden eyes darkened instantly, to a lethal, bloody shade of amber. The tender worship in his gaze completely vanished, replaced by pure, unfiltered, murderous rage. He didn't look at his enforcer, and he didn't look toward the blocked cave entrance. He looked directly into Odelia's terrified eyes. "Stay behind me," the king commanded softly. The deep, vibrating rumble of his voice made the very earth beneath her boots tremble with anticipation. He stood up to his full, terrifying height, his long black claws extending fully from his fingertips. The true monster was finally awake. Chapter 4. The heavy scent of burning pine torches and fresh blood choked the cave entrance. Thane's roar shattered the cavern walls. It was not the sound of a man. It was the deafening, bone-rattling battle cry of a primal nightmare, finally breaking off its chains. Shadows violently coiled around the king's massive, muscular body. The sickening, wet crunch of shifting bones echoed over the howling wind. Thick, dark fur erupted from his tearing skin. In less than a single heartbeat, the king was completely gone. A monstrous black wolf stood in his place. He was easily 10 feet tall at the shoulder. His fur was as dark as pitch, absorbing the flickering light from the encroaching torches. His eyes burned like twin, blood-soaked suns in the absolute darkness of the cavern. The alpha aura instantly exploded outward. Odelia collapsed hard onto her hands and knees. The sheer, crushing pressure of his dominance stole all the oxygen from her lungs. She gasped desperately for air, her fingernails scraping uselessly against the freezing rock floor. The black wolf launched himself into the blizzard. He moved like a streak of violent dark lightning. The absolute silence of the mountain was instantly broken by the terrifying sounds of pure slaughter. Odelia dragged herself toward the jagged cave opening. She used the rough stone wall to pull her trembling body upright. Bram did not try to stop her. The silver-haired enforcer stood completely still, his pale face illuminated by the distant dying light of the border army's dropped torches. The pristine white snow was already painted a horrific dark crimson. There was no battle on the mountain ridge. It was a completely one-sided massacre. In less than 3 minutes, half of Cormac's elite border guard lay motionless in the snowdrifts. The survivors immediately threw their weapons away. They dropped hard to their knees in the freezing slush. They bared their throats to the winter sky, whimpering and crying like terrified, beaten pups begging for mercy. The black wolf stood menacingly in the center of the carnage. Beneath his massive, deadly front paws lay Cormac. The arrogant border alpha was pinned flat on his back, coughing up thick droplets of blood. Thane's razor-sharp black claws easily pierced his brother's heavy iron armor, digging deep into his chest. The massive beast bared his dripping fangs. A deep, vibrating growl shook the snow from the surrounding pine trees. The black wolf opened his massive jaws, aiming directly for Cormac's exposed, pulsing throat. He was going to execute his own brother. "Stop!" Odelia's voice was remarkably quiet. It was fragile, completely lacking any alpha command. Yet somehow, the single word easily sliced right through the chaotic, howling blizzard. The black wolf froze completely. His massive, terrifying head snapped toward the cave entrance. Those glowing, blood-red eyes locked onto her pale, shivering form. The absolute, unhinged bloodlust radiating from the beast was enough to level an entire city. Odelia stepped out of the cave. Her bare feet sank deep into the freezing, blood-soaked snow. She did not scream. She did not run away in terror. Her deeply ingrained survival instincts were completely silent. For the first time in her miserable life, she felt entirely safe. She understood, with absolute certainty, that this terrifying, world-ending monster would burn the entire continent to ash just to keep her breathing. She walked slowly toward the center of the slaughter. The scent of copper and heavy frost enveloped her completely. She stopped right in front of the beast's massive, snarling muzzle. The heat radiating from his giant body was intense, fighting off the biting winter wind. Odelia slowly raised her pale, trembling hand. The very tips of her fingers still hummed with the faint, warm residue of the dark magic she had consumed. She pressed her bare palm completely flat against the thick, coarse fur of the black wolf's cheek. "Do not dirty your hands with his blood," she whispered softly. The giant beast shuddered violently under her tiny hand. The terrifying, bone-rattling snarl slowly faded. It morphed into a low, rumbling whine that vibrated deep within his massive chest. The monster leaned heavily into her delicate touch, slowly closing his burning, murderous eyes. Beneath the wolf's paws, Cormac stared up in absolute, paralyzing horror. His arrogant mind simply could not process what he was seeing. The most ruthless, bloodthirsty king in the history of the Empire was completely submitting to the gentle touch of a wolfless reject. The massive stone fireplace roared to life inside the Black Vein castle. Odelia sat curled up in an oversized velvet chair. The grand marble-floored bedchamber was incredibly warm. The comforting scents of burning pine wood and fresh mountain snow helped to steady her racing heart. The heavy oak door clicked open. Bram walked into the quiet room. He carried a silver tray holding a single steaming cup of herbal tea. The enforcer did not have his usual arrogant smirk. His sharp features were tight, drawn, and intensely serious. "You saved his life today," Bram said quietly. He set the silver tray down on a small table beside her chair. He didn't sit down. He stood tall, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. Odelia looked up at him. The firelight reflected brightly in her dark eyes. "I only did what I had to do." Bram sighed heavily, running a tired hand through his messy silver hair. "Perhaps," the enforcer murmured, "but there is a truth you must hear. And you need to hear it from me before this mating bond goes any further." The temperature in the warm room suddenly felt completely freezing. Odelia gripped the soft velvet arms of the chair. A cold, sinking feeling of deep dread slowly coiled in the very bottom of her stomach. Her wolf instincts remained silent, but her human intuition screamed a warning. "What truth?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Bram looked her dead in the eye. He offered no comforting smile. "Did you honestly believe a miserable coward like Cormac had the courage to publicly reject you at the Red Altar all on his own?" The question hung heavy in the silent room. Odelia stopped breathing. The crackling sounds of the fire suddenly seemed millions of miles away. "What are you saying?" she choked out. "I am saying it was the king," Bram stated, his voice completely void of emotion. "Thane orchestrated the entire thing from the shadows." Odelia's fingers dug viciously into the velvet fabric. "He explicitly threatened to tear Cormac into pieces if he didn't publicly discard you today," Bram continued ruthlessly. "He staged your ultimate humiliation perfectly. He needed an ironclad, legal excuse to step in and claim you right in front of the borderlands." The absolute betrayal hit Odelia like a physical blow to the chest. "Why?" she asked, a single tear slipping down her pale cheek. "Because the shadow assassins were already closing in." Bram answered darkly. "He had to extract you immediately, before the bounty hunters realized the ancient Venom Moon bloodline was actively beating inside your chest." Odelia stared completely blankly into the roaring fire. The Alpha King hadn't saved her from humiliation. He had engineered it. She wasn't just a rescued mate. She was a manipulated pawn on a very dangerous, bloody chessboard. Chapter 5. The heavy oak door slammed shut. Odelia stood dead center in the grand bedchamber. The roaring fire behind her did nothing to warm the sudden freezing ice in her veins. She stared at the closed door, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. The lock clicked. Thane stepped out of the dark stone hallway. He was no longer the monstrous black wolf. He was in his human form, completely shirtless, his broad chest heaving with heavy, exhausted breaths. Fresh, violent scars littered his incredibly muscular torso. The metallic scent of blood and melting snow clung heavily to his skin. He looked at her. His golden eyes were bright, cautious, and incredibly intense. "Bram told me," Odelia said. Her voice shook, but she refused to back down. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "He told me exactly what you did at the Red Altar. You manipulated Cormac. You threatened his life just to force that public rejection." Thane stopped moving. He didn't look surprised. He didn't try to deny it. He just stood there, a towering wall of lethal, unyielding muscle, absorbing her absolute fury. "You played me like a pathetic, helpless pawn on a chessboard," Odelia yelled, the sharp betrayal finally cracking her voice. "You orchestrated my humiliation in front of thousands of people. You made me believe I was entirely worthless just so you could swoop in and play the hero." "I am no hero, Odelia." His voice was a dark, vibrating rumble. It shook the glass in the tall windows. He closed the distance between them in 3 long, deliberate strides. Odelia instinctively took a step backward, but her spine hit the warm stone of the fireplace mantel. She was completely trapped. Thane didn't reach for her throat. He didn't use his overwhelming alpha aura to force her submission. Instead, the most terrifying, bloodthirsty king in the entire empire slowly dropped to his knees. The heavy thud of his body hitting the marble floor echoed loudly in the quiet room. Odelia gasped aloud. Her hands dropped to her sides in pure, unfiltered shock. He was kneeling perfectly at her feet. His broad, heavily scarred shoulders were bowed in absolute, unquestionable surrender. "I am a monster," Thane whispered, looking up at her with burning, desperate golden eyes. "And I would gladly become the villain of 1,000 different worlds if it meant keeping you breathing in this one." Odelia couldn't speak. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. He reached up with a trembling, calloused hand. He didn't grab her. He gently, almost reverently, pressed 2 rough fingers directly against her temple. "Look," he commanded softly. The grand bedchamber completely vanished. A blinding flash of silver light exploded in Odelia's mind. The heavy scent of burning pine was instantly replaced by the horrific, suffocating smell of ash, rotting magic, and widespread death. She was suddenly standing in the ruins of an ancient burning city. The sky above was a terrifying shade of bleeding crimson. A man knelt in the mud, screaming in pure, soul-shattering agony. It was Thane, but he looked younger, his golden eyes wide with absolute, uncontrolled terror. In his arms lay a woman. She had Odelia's face. Her chest was completely torn open, bleeding out a glowing obsidian-black light that faded rapidly into the mud. "I cannot save you," the younger Thane sobbed, his massive body shaking violently. "You will find me again," the dying woman whispered, her pale hand reaching up to touch his blood-soaked cheek. "When the venom moon rises, find me, my king." The horrific vision shattered like cheap glass. Odelia gasped violently, stumbling forward. Thane caught her instantly, his massive, warm arms wrapping securely around her waist. He pulled her flush against his solid chest, holding her as she aggressively fought to catch her breath. 300 years, Thane growled softly into her dark hair. His massive body trembled against hers. I searched for you through 3 centuries of endless, agonizing silence. When I finally found you hidden in that miserable border pack, the shadow assassins were already tracking your scent. He pulled back slightly, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. I had to extract you legally, he pleaded, his voice thick with raw, ancient pain. If I had simply stolen you, the entire continent would have declared war. I would rather you hate me for the rest of eternity than watch you die in my arms a second time. The icy betrayal inside Odelia's chest completely melted away. It was instantly replaced by a surging, overwhelming wave of dark, wild magic. The ancient venom moon power inside her recognized the Alpha King. It recognized its absolute equal. It craved him. Her survival instincts didn't tell her to run anymore. They told her to claim what was hers. Odelia reached up and grabbed the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck. She didn't hesitate. She crashed her lips desperately against his. Thane groaned loudly, a deep, feral sound that vibrated straight through her bones. The careful restraint he had been showing completely snapped. He crushed her violently against his heavy chest, his mouth demanding and dominant, tasting of raw power and endless devotion. The mating bond ignited instantly. It wasn't a spark. It was a massive, blinding forest fire of pure energy. It rushed rapidly through Odelia's veins, connecting her fragile human heart directly to the massive, beating core of the Black Wolf. He carried her easily toward the massive 4-poster bed. The heavy furs and soft velvet swallowed them whole. Odelia surrendered completely to the overwhelming heat of his skin. Every rough touch, every desperate kiss healed a deep, invisible wound she hadn't even known she carried. They moved together in absolute, perfect synchronization. The powerful alpha magic blended flawlessly with her dark, wild energy. The room practically vibrated with the sheer, impossible force of their joining. Odelia threw her head back, crying out his name as the blinding peak of the mating bond finally crashed heavily over them both. It was pure, absolute perfection. Then the world suddenly tilted sharply on its axis. A horrific, freezing cold sensation exploded violently in the very center of Odelia's chest. She gasped, her eyes snapping wide open in sudden, paralyzing terror. The beautiful, glowing energy of the mating bond instantly turned entirely black. A foul, metallic taste flooded the back of her throat. She tried to call out to Thane, but her lungs completely refused to expand. Odelia choked violently. She leaned heavily over the edge of the mattress and coughed. A thick, horrific splatter of necrotic black blood hit the white marble floor. The assassin's shadow curse hadn't just been a simple poison. It was a hidden death seal, and the ancient, powerful magic of the mating bond had just permanently locked it into her beating heart. Chapter 6. The white marble floor was stained pitch black. Odelia couldn't breathe. Her lungs felt exactly like they were filled with crushed glass and burning ash. She collapsed sideways off the edge of the massive bed. Thane caught her before she hit the cold stone. "No," the Alpha King roared. It was a sound of absolute world-ending terror. It shook the heavy oak beams of the ceiling. He gathered her fragile, violently trembling body into his massive arms. The sickly green and black veins were spreading rapidly up her pale neck. The shadow curse was awake, and it was actively eating her human heart from the inside out. The heavy bedchamber door burst open. Bram sprinted into the room, his hands already glowing with crackling blue energy. The silver-haired enforcer took one look at the black blood on the floor and stopped dead in his tracks. His glowing magic instantly fizzled out. The mating bond, Bram breathed in sheer horror. It accelerated the hidden death seal. She has less than 3 minutes before her heart completely stops. "Get out," Thane snarled, his golden eyes blazing with feral, unhinged panic. Bram didn't argue. He backed out of the room and slammed the heavy door shut, leaving the king entirely alone with his dying mate. Odelia's vision began to tunnel. The roaring fire in the massive stone hearth faded to a cold, distant, meaningless blur. The intense heat of Thane's skin was the only thing anchoring her to the physical world. The scent of rotting magic was suffocating her. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice barely a rough whisper. "Do not speak," Thane commanded. His rough, calloused hands were shaking violently against her skin. "I did not tear through 300 years of endless silence just to watch you bleed out on my floor." He shifted his weight, pinning her securely against his broad chest. Thane extended his right hand. His long, lethal black claws slid smoothly from his fingertips. Without a single second of hesitation, the Alpha King slashed his own palm deep down to the bone. Odelia gasped as the heavy, overwhelming scent of pure alpha blood flooded the freezing room. It didn't smell like normal blood. It smelled like ancient forests, rolling thunderstorms, and raw, unfiltered power. It was incredibly hot, practically humming with pure life force. Thane pressed his bleeding hand directly over Odelia's failing, cursed heart. "I, King Alpha Thane of the Black Vein Empire, invoke the blood oath," he rumbled. His deep voice vibrated with ancient, heavy magic. The very air inside the bedroom began to crackle and spark with wild energy. "Take my life, take my wolf, take my soul." He leaned down fiercely and pressed his bloody lips directly to hers. He forced his pure, raw life force straight down her throat. He wasn't just healing her. He was forcefully tearing his own alpha spirit in half and violently shoving it into her dying body. Odelia's back arched sharply off the floor. The ancient venom moon magic sleeping deep in her marrow violently woke up. It tasted the willing, desperate sacrifice of a pure-blood Alpha King. The two wildly opposing forces, dark, absorbing healing, and pure, dominant destruction, slammed directly into each other. A blinding, concussive wave of pure silver light exploded in the center of the bedroom. The sheer force of the blast shattered the tall glass windows outward. It blew the heavy oak doors entirely off their iron hinges. The thick stone walls of the castle groaned under the immense pressure. The necrotic black veins on Odelia's pale skin instantly turned a brilliant glowing silver. The shadow curse practically shrieked. It was completely obliterated in a single heartbeat, burned into harmless, invisible ash by the overwhelming power of their fused souls. Odelia took a massive, desperate, gasping breath. Pure oxygen flooded her burning lungs. Her heart slammed a steady, incredibly powerful rhythm against her ribs. She opened her eyes. They were no longer dark brown. They glowed with a fierce, terrifying, ethereal silver light. She didn't feel human anymore. She didn't feel weak. She didn't feel wolfless. A massive spectral outline of a majestic silver-furred wolf shimmered into existence right behind her shoulders. It projected an aura of pure, absolute divinity. It was a terrifying, breathtaking combination of ancient magic and royal alpha dominance. Thane sat back heavily on his heels. He looked completely exhausted. His broad chest heaved, his skin pale from the massive blood loss. but his glowing golden eyes were fiercely triumphant. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated worship. Odelia slowly sat up. She reached out and grabbed the king's bloody, scarred hand. Her grip was no longer fragile. It was ironclad, strong enough to easily crush bone. The wild magic purred heavily in her veins. "Mine," she whispered. Her voice was heavily layered with the deep, echoing, terrifying growl of her newly awakened beast. Thane smiled. It was a dark, incredibly predatory grin that reached his glowing eyes. "Yours." 3 days later. The great hall smelled intensely of burning incense, polished iron, and deep, unquestionable fear. Odelia sat perfectly still on the massive obsidian throne. She wore a heavy, intricate crown of forged black steel. A long, dark velvet cape spilled over the stone steps. Her glowing silver eyes calmly surveyed the massive, terrified crowd. The entire Black Vein kingdom was on their knees. In the dead center of the polished marble floor, heavy iron chains rattled loudly. Cormac was dragged forward roughly by 2 massive royal guards. The former Border Alpha looked completely broken. His armor was gone. His face was deeply bruised, his eyes wide with absolute pathetic terror. He was thrown hard onto the stone. He fell flat on his face directly before the twin thrones. "Mercy," Cormac whimpered, pressing his forehead into the cold marble. He didn't dare look up at her. His scent was entirely sour with panic. "Please, my queen, have mercy." Odelia didn't move an inch. She didn't feel a single ounce of anger toward the man who had publicly humiliated her at the red altar. She didn't feel vindictive. She just felt absolute, cold, untouchable indifference. He was entirely beneath her notice. "Exile," Odelia commanded. Her voice wasn't a shout, but it easily carried across the vast, silent hall. It was heavy, with true, undisputed alpha dominance. Several wolves in the front row whimpered and pressed their heads lower to the floor. "Strip his wolf from his blood," she continued coldly. "Throw him out into the frozen deadlands. If he ever crosses the Black Vein border again, execute him on sight." Cormac screamed in pure despair. The royal guards hauled the thrashing, crying traitor away by his heavy iron chains, dragging him out of the great hall. Thane stood tall directly beside her throne. He wore his formal black military uniform. He reached down and rested a heavy, intensely possessive hand on her velvet-clad shoulder. The entire hall could physically feel the terrifying, unified front of their combined magic pressing down on the room. Near the massive stone pillars at the edge of the hall, Bram leaned casually against the wall. The silver-haired enforcer wore his finest dark suit. He held a delicate painted porcelain teacup. He took a loud, completely inappropriate sip of hot tea right in the middle of the dead silent coronation ceremony. "I absolutely hate organizing these stuffy royal parties," Bram muttered under his breath to the stoic guard standing rigidly next to him. "But I suppose watching a borderland reject become the most terrifying, all-powerful deity in the Empire makes all the extra paperwork worth it." Odelia heard his whisper perfectly. A tiny, genuine smile touched the corner of her lips. She leaned her head back, resting it gently against Thane's strong arm. The Alpha King looked down at her, his golden eyes burning with endless devotion, dangerous possessiveness, and absolute pride. She wasn't a rejected mate anymore. She wasn't a fragile pawn meant to be discarded. She was the Venom Moon. She was the Alpha Queen. And the terrifying golden era of the Black Vein Empire had only just begun.